Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get going in honor of everybody's time. So my name's Tom Fleischner. I'm the executive director of the Natural History Institute, based here in Prescott, Arizona. And this program tonight is a real special treat for us all, and it's a jointly offered by the Institute and the Peregrine Book Company. Um, Here, a wonderful independent bookstore here in Prescott, and so you'll be hearing more about that. I'm gonna turn it over to my friend and colleague Susan Lang here from the Peregrine Company in a moment. Just wanted to cover. I know a lot of people have been on a lot of different Zoom type events, and they're all run a little differently. So I wanted to be clear how we're going to do this. As you know, we've had the chat function on here for people to say hello. In just a few couple of minutes here, we're going to be turning that off, just so that it's not a distraction on the sidebar while Tyson and others are talking. But what we are going to do for the question and answer phase, which is of course one of the most important parts of this. If you are not familiar with Zoom, if you look at the sort of a menu bar on the bottom of your Zoom screen towards the right side, there should be a little icon that is Q&A. So that's the question and answer icon. And as we go along, feel free to type in a question as we go, and then a little bit later on, we will be kind of referring to that list and sort of bringing your questions into the discussion. We won't be, just so you know, your image won't be coming up on screen when we do that, so it's fine to be in your pajamas or what have you, but your voices will be heard via us. Okay, so without further ado, I will want to introduce again my friend Susan Lang from the Peregrine Book Company here, who will get us started and introduce our speaker. So Susan.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad you have joined us this evening for our conversation with Tyson Yunkaporta. I'd also like to acknowledge other Indigenous folks, the Yavapai, Hopi, and Navajo that may have joined us, we hope, and to recognize their elders. And I'd like to thank a bunch of people really quickly before I get to the introduction. I want to thank the Harper publicists, Maxwell Chandley and Melinda Mullen, for all their help in making it possible for this to happen. And especially want to thank too the Natural History Institute worked with us to, Bob Ellis, Pat Zemer, Zora Lungareed, Tom Fleischner there, for working with all the intricate details that it takes to make this kind of thing happen. And to Tom again for agreeing to use his moderating skills. Also thank Ty Morris and David Kapot of the Peregrine Book Company for their contributions. And of course, I wanted to thank Tyson Yunkaporta for agreeing to join us and clear from Australia for this conversation, or in his terms, for yarning with us. And to Jane, who helped the connection wherever she is. Dr. Tyson Yunkaporta belongs to the Appalachian clan of far north Queensland, Australia. Tyson, if I'm not pronouncing things like they do in Australia, you can correct me or just let it go. I don't care. He works as a senior lecturer in Indigenous languages in Deakin University. He's won many awards, such as the Big Ideas Award from the Kevin Rudd Foundation. There are endless labels to describe him: scholar, educator, author, maker of traditional wooden tools, art critic, thinker, and poet are just a few. But in the scope, variety, and diversity of his work, Yunkaporta defies any efforts toward branding, the kind of branding we in Western culture are so apt to do. I'm grateful to him, to you, Tyson, for writing this remarkable book with ideas that this culture so needs to consider as tools for creating a sustainable relationship to the natural world, and grateful that Tyson has come here to discuss them with us. So now Tom Fleischner, the head of the Natural History Institute in Prescott, take over and start the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thanks again to Peregrine, who is one of our favorite collaborating organizations. We do work together quite often. So Tyson, just want to add my congratulations on this book. If people have not yet seen it, so you can get a hit of the cover. We all highly recommend you get a copy, and the Peregrine Book Company's contact information will be available on here before we're done. Tyson, I just wanted to maybe start by inviting you to reflect just a little bit on the genesis of the book, and how did you come to write this? And particularly, I'm really interested because you mention in the book that written language rewires the human brain, and that it's I might be exaggerating what your point a little bit, but almost as if can be a potential danger in writing things down that are derived from such a long, robust oral tradition. So with those kind of hazards, you might say, in the face of somebody aiming to represent this kind of tradition, you made, what I think is sort of a courageous choice to try to put this down in writing. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about what led to that choice and what led to the book in general, we'd love to hear. So.
Oh man, I I mean, as Susan said, my branding's not great, and I really wish I had like a romantic, exotic sort of story to tell you about that, and this sort of wise Aborigine thing, but I'm not that. I'm just a very cheeky boy who's trying not to die on the side of the road in the rain. Yeah, basically the book happened because my woman wanted to get married. So, and well, we both want to get married, but she wants to have a proper wedding, and we just don't have the money for that. And this publisher, the text publishing in Australia, they contacted me and asked me to write a book because they read an article that I'd written, and it was looking at the works of that Vincent van Gogh, that Dutch artist. I was looking at his work around the seasons, but from an Aboriginal seasonal perspective. And so most of my work does that. It's like I don't, I'm not reporting on our culture for people to look at and say, isn't that pretty? I look back through our own sort of cultural lens, And he said, oh, that'd make a good book. Can you write that book for me? I'll give you an advance. And we needed that money, so I said, yeah, I'll do that. So yeah, never intended for it to be that. But I guess on the other side, for decades now, there's senior elders and knowledge keepers and law keepers in our traditions from all over this continent. In my travels and works all over Australia, they've been passing me these stories and messages to take out, to the world in my travels. And particularly Old Man Juma was a big one. He was half of the symbols in the book, the Sandtalk symbols. Sandtalk being, when you draw something on the ground, to convey information in our tradition. Yeah, they were from him, and sort of he wanted them spread as far and wide as possible. Yeah, so I kind of saw this book as a chance to sort of settle all the demands on me in a few of my relationships. So A, give my woman the wedding that she wants to have, and B, like use the book as a vehicle to get these messages out that these old fellas are giving me to spread, because it was getting pretty hard doing it one-on-one, just traveling around talking to people. That was going pretty slow. Yeah, but yeah, they said that it'd probably only sell 1,000 copies or something, that it was just going to be really small. Like I think initially they did a really small print run. and we didn't really do much publicity or anything like that, but it's just gone on the grapevine, you know, this word of mouth, and it's kind of semi-viral that way, going out into the world. Which, if I'd known that was going to happen, I would have written it differently, you know, because I wrote it really intimately and trying to come from that pronoun that we have in Aboriginal languages of that translates as us too,
Right.
because we've got a few different pronouns in our languages, different ways of saying us depending on who the us is. And so I was writing that like in a dialogue with the reader, because the idea is the reader is bringing their stories alongside the stories that I'm bringing from those old people, you know, and sort of sitting down with that like it's a yarn, a sharing of stories, a coming together of stories. So I wrote it quite intimately with the expectation that I'd be able to meet the obligations of all those relationships, all the little us twos that I made with authors. And now I'm like, I can't keep up. And there's too many people, you know, too many emails, and and I try to talk to everybody, but you can't talk to that many tens of thousands of people. It's just too much. So that's how the book happened. It was kind of accidental, but you know, I hadn't really thought about where it was all going, you know, all those journeys over years and years, you know, especially because I'm a very low status person, you know, in my community. But these old people were sharing all these things with me. And it's just because of the peculiarities of my being, and the weird skill sets that I've got. I kind of have the ability to translate, you know, ideas across,
Right.
but translate them not just, you know, linguistically, and not just culturally, but also contextually, you know, like particularly looking at the broad context of what's going on in the world. You know, the way the entire biosphere is dying off, and you know, having that complex Indigenous lens, way of looking at all these problems and the causes and effects and all the interrelated, you know, variables and all that kind of thing. I can see that, and I can see the pattern of where it's going, and I'm able to sort of bring that pattern, the Indigenous pattern, across and you know, make that transferable. You know, because people are like, everybody's looking for this Indigenous wisdom, like, you know, Indigenous people around the world been, you know, living sustainably on this land for, you know, millennia. For some reason, forgetting that 5 minutes ago, everybody was Indigenous in that way. You know, everybody was living sustainably on a land base, in a habitat, as part of that habitat, you know. And that until very recently in human history, the concepts of nature and society were not separate concepts. There weren't even concepts for those things. It was just one thing, you know. So we were embedded in this planet, in this land, that we stand on. And it's just, people are looking for answers for, you know, people who are still carrying a living memory of that. And I don't know, there isn't really anybody who's still living like that. You know, even in the most remote, you know, untouched people who are, you know, still living their customary lifestyles, that the land has changed. You know, there isn't the same abundance that was. There is a massive die-off, extinction going on, that, you know, has sort of changed the way everybody lives. So Indigenous people really are just people who are carrying that memory of what it is to live in that way, within that pattern of the land, within that law of the land. And mostly, you know, 99% of us, that's intensely disrupted, and we're not living in the same way. We don't even look the same way that we did, you know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. You know, but we're carrying that memory. And I probably should take that opportunity to pay respects all around the world to the, you know, original peoples of the land where you are. Whether you're in Taiwan, there are still Indigenous groups there who are carrying that memory. Whether you're in Finland or anywhere, there's that big, strong memory of what that is, and we need to keep that, but not just the snippets of this is how you make a dream catcher or whatever, because that's just material culture. That's just something people use as window dressing now and extract from these cultures. So it's not the paint and feathers. It's not that stuff. That's just ours. We just do that. But it's the pattern of the knowledge. It's those patterns of the way of seeing the world, the ways of thinking that are intensely contextual and relational, the ways of being that make you extremely adaptive and constantly adapting and evolving in relation to a constantly changing landscape, which has always been the way of human beings. So I guess when we think about Indigenous knowledge at that level, what we're thinking about is actual real human knowledge, not just what the complicated things that have been tinkered over the last century or so, but the real human knowledge, of what it is to be an entity that is of the landscape, and more importantly, an entity that is a custodial species. And that's the most important thing, that that's our ecological niche here. We have to be in that landscape, and we have to be custodians of that landscape. That's why we have that gift of being able to see holistically, be able to see right across the complex dynamic systems that we inhabit, whether these be economies or forest ecologies. It's all one thing. Yeah. So I didn't want to just monologue today.
Yeah.
It'd be good if this was a bit of a yarn.
Yeah.
So we're back
So
and forth. And if anybody wants to jump in and say something,
so,
chat or any other way, then go ahead.
That's great. As far as those two different reasons you said for the motivations for writing the book, it seems like they're both being incredibly successful, both the one on the home front and also obviously the huge response all over the world that you're having to the book shows that the trust that was placed in you was well founded. Seems it almost seemed as though you were sort of anointed by some of the elders because of your translating capability to be able to go out and do that, and it seems like it's been very effective. So my hat's off to you. I'm curious, tying in with what you said about these responsibilities and these sort of custodial responsibilities that Indigenous peoples have, and the fact that so many people who do not see themselves as Indigenous, but as you say, perhaps were not so long ago, but there's this hunger for it, and so your book is providing a great opportunity in that way. And yet it seems to me there's a bit of a tension there for some people, because there's also for a lot of people of good intention, there's also a reluctance or a caution about borrowing things that maybe we don't have a right to borrow, or sometimes going by the moniker of cultural appropriation or what have you. So
it's a difficult relation, isn't it?
Yeah. It seemed to me in the reading of your book that you were very open to and inviting people in, as the presence of the book itself would suggest. But I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to say about that. Like, is it okay for everybody else to be coming in and trying to take some of this knowledge, and put it into our own context?
Yeah, well, I'm not somebody who can give permissions for that kind of things, but everything that's in that book is things that have been openly shared with me, and that's been requested to share with others. So I think pretty much everything in there should be okay. Great. For people to think through and work with, I guess. But I don't know. I guess it depends how you do it, and it is really difficult, because we're all kind of trapped in these roles, and then they're not just cultural roles, because I find it hard to separate the cultural and the economic, because we're in these sort of economic identities now, rather than cultural ones. And it's the economy that determines your culture, so we're all supposed to be these rugged individuals, these almost like little miniature corporations unto ourselves, each person. And that's part of my thing about this branding business, that I resist that branding. It's more of a culture jam than anything else. And it's just a petty little act of resistance, really. But we're all in these roles, but there's this relation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and even just, the imperial sort of center of the Anglosphere, and everything else that lies at the margins of that. It's this extractive imperative, there's this it's kind of like it's economically driven as much as anything else, and nobody really knows any other way to relate. So when we're relating to each other, it's as extractor and extractee, and I don't know, and idiots like me who create these safe spaces to invite people in, it's often inviting destruction, and more extraction. So it's that is an uncomfortable and dangerous space to be in. We're all in a dangerous space. I mean, how can we talk to each other without sitting in that relation?
Yes, I was surprised at your willingness, and the willingness of the people that you have learned from, to share a lot of that information. The Indigenous nations here are very, very secretive, because for good reason, because they have let people in and had their ideas distorted, branded. So I was happy to see that that there was some hope that we could learn from each other.
Well, people are looking for their exotic trinkets,
I know.
And these things are mined, or little snippets of wisdom and things like that. And every dialogue is ruined, with those things and that focus, where we're supposed to perform our cultures, in these dialogues, but just the surface level stuff. But I feel like it's a much safer space to speak from if we're talking about systems, if we're talking about complexity and we're talking about the big patterns and the big trends. If we're talking about that from our cultural perspective, that's pretty safe stuff to deal with, because that's stuff that idiots don't understand. So they can't just take it and hang it off their rear view mirror in their car, but then, but we all need to be doing this work together of looking at all these systems that we're laboring under. And if we're looking at this problematic relation that we have as a systemic thing, and as an economic sort of pattern that's been imposed on us, and that has set the boundaries of our relationships together, if we look at it like that, rather than policing individual behaviors, policing individual speech, which, I mean, frankly, at the moment, that there's nothing that anybody can say that's right, unless, I mean, there's one thing that you can say that's right, and that's pointing out that somebody else is saying something wrong. That's kind of the only unassailable position anybody can take right now. So therefore, of course, there's just going to be endless struggle, endless just violence, and of course, while we're all swirling around, wrestling the pig, doing that, we're not looking at the the big massive systemic tricks that are being performed on us, and the big lenses that are being slid over our eyes, and the massive, large-scale manipulations that are occurring. So I guess, you know, our dialogues need to be at that level. And they need to be at that level where we're exchanging stories at that level of meta knowledge, rather than at the level of, you know, little exotic cultural items that we can share with each other. And go, oh, here's some of my food. Taste that. Oh, can I taste some of your food? Oh, that's interesting. Mayonnaise. You know, here's some hot sauce. Oh, look, and we'll do the handshake. Oh, we're coming together. There's just nothing in that. You know?
One thing that sort of ties in, another thing that you said that on the surface seems paradoxical, but fits very nice, I think, is that you said the assistance people need is not in learning about Aboriginal knowledge, but in remembering their own. So that's kind of interesting, because there's this hunger that we've been talking about for people to learn what you know, Indigenous people have, and yet I thought, a very healthy reminder that you know, you've got your own wisdom traditions. Don't forget that.
And not even just traditions, but you know, the things that are encoded bodily, you know, into your schema as a member of this species. You know, there's, you know, whales know where to go when they're born. You know, nobody's teaching them that. You know, we have the same things in us. You know, you can walk outside and shift your lens to be able to notice what's flowering and what other things are going on in that time, and patterns in the weather. You know, even if you're right in the middle of a city, you know, to actually become the pattern recognition machine that you are, which is what humans are. And it's just a step up from that once you master it, to becoming a custodian. And that's all it is. You know, but people are still trapped in this idea that they've got to mind the margins for this exotica. So there was a woman from Holland who contacted me, and she was like, I need to find, I read your book and I really want to, but I don't know how can I find the Aborigines that I can connect with and learn this wisdom? And I'm like, oh, did you read the book? Like, really? Like, read it again. What's wrong with you? Okay, where are you? So you're in Holland. Okay, do you know any Frisian people? And she's like, oh, I am Frisian. Like, okay, so you have a traditional language that's not Dutch, and you're living in Free. Yes, I'm living on Frisian land, and yes, and I look after my wetlands, and then suddenly all this stuff comes out, and it's like, and then she's sending me all these pictures. Yes, this is the ceremony that the women of my village do, like every year, you know, and we are scantily clad or naked, and we go as soon as the water freezes over, we go into the forest, and we make skates out of this particular stick from a particular tree, and then we skate across the ice, you know, almost naked, you know, in defiance of the winter, and that's part of a big ceremony that we do, and then, you know, and I'm going, so you're Indigenous, and she's like, you know, yes, but I'm Eastern Frisian, and there's Western Frisians over there. They're a bunch of bastards anyway. They're not even real Frisians. They're descended from Vikings, for fuck's sake, you know, and. And I'm like, oh, so you have, like, you know, factions and lateral violence and denying each other's identity. Yeah, you're definitely Indigenous. You know, so I'm like, why are you looking to me? Why are you looking to the Southern Hemisphere to find your knowledge? It's right there. Just go, be in your place. Are you insane? But even she, like an Indigenous woman, is right there, like trapped under this monolithic idea of this, you know, blackness and whiteness and exoticness and Indigenous is other, that is somewhere else and couldn't possibly be in her, you know. But she's there.
That you just touched on something I was interested in hearing a little more about, because you said something in the book that I thought was really great. That you said any move towards sustainability requires less simplistic views of identities, so that we can really see how much diversity we really have. And you specifically called out that the notion of whiteness as being a particularly unhelpful or not useful term.
Yeah.
And that's of course especially interesting right now, especially here in the United States, with all of the turmoil, constructive turmoil that's going on right now as people try to confront the history of racism here and so on.
Yeah.
But it also can sometimes become oversimplified, I think. So
Yeah.
can you share a little bit about how that manifests in your context in Australia or in the
Yeah, well, it's confusing because it's in our language. I know you asked that question about language earlier that I never answered, but the English language is very limiting, and and we have, a lot of the terms that we have are left over from an age that doesn't exist anymore, and so we have very simplistic terms that don't quite define what our relationship is. These complex relationships. I don't know. So you've got in Africa, you've got the Namadi people, and they're fair-skinned people, live in the desert. They got hunting dogs, and they live a traditional lifestyle. But they're being colonized and genocided by black colonists, black imperialists who are stealing their land and destroying their culture and their people. There's this and I talk about the Same people. All over Europe there are indigenous peoples. There's and all throughout Asia, pretty much everywhere on the planet, you've got this relation going on, this wrong relation, and it's not divided very well along the terms that we use to describe it. And I guess, it's these, cultural identities has become part of this neoliberal kind of mechanism of branding, where whatever your intersectionalities are, or, that these things become part of your brand now more than anything else, but the branding occurs, under these centuries old rubric. Just doesn't make any sense. The whole thing, it's just such a mess. It's just such a big conflagration of mixed up people, trying to define themselves and their reality. And I guess all of that feeds into that bigger the crisis of meaning that people are talking about now. We've woken up and looked around us, and this social fragmentation of the last 3 decades or so has taken its toll, and we're all these little individuals who are claiming identities belonging to these groups that are fragmented anyway, and they're really just a collection of artifacts and signifiers that are starting to lose meaning.
So
someone has go ahead. I was going to ask a question that came in, but you go ahead. I'll ask it afterwards.
Okay, yeah, and I actually wanted to just remind people, because I think we had a number of people joining us a little bit late, that if you are interested in adding questions for Tyson to the mix, you can use the little Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and write that down, and then we'll end up passing that along here in a bit. But Tyson, before we get to that, I just wanted, you I think make a lot of great gestures in the book towards how and where we need to change, and some of the ways towards doing that. And you make a very strong and repeated point about the crucial importance of story and larger narratives in cultures. And so I guess the question really is how do we, recognizing that, how do we create new stories? And you also make a point that I think is really interesting, that that the use of metaphor is one of the points of commonality between indigenous and non-indigenous cultures, that we all do that. So just curious if you have any thoughts of like what metaphors might help us now, might be helpful to our
So
common shared futures, or and
how do we make new stories? The thing is, we need to stop making stories, because stories just are. You know, stories come out of the field. They come out of the dynamic systems we live in, and out of the spirit of those things. You know, and this is, and I guess the most helpful metaphor, I think, that everybody can you know, adopt a common language around, I think, is complexity theory. And there's a concept in there of emergence. You know, you know, somebody, you know, you couldn't tinker life out of that primordial soup. That was an emergence, you know, from that from complexity, and from all those combinatorials happening in there. That was an emergence. And in the same way, stories emerge. You know, creation is something that's always in motion and has this emergence happening, you know, and that's that big spirit stuff that we're all connected to, you know, and it has substance and it's real. And it's what, you know, a lot of us refer to as law, like LAW, capital L, you know, that it's there, and it's in the landscape and in creation, and also from, you know, what you might call outer space. You know, it's coming down and flowing and exchanging and coming through all the time. And that's the way stories need to happen. What we do need to do is kill a lot of the stories that have been the complicated stories that have been tinkered, you know, as an illusion, that have not come from creation. These grand narratives that have been placed over us all, those ones need to go. But we need to at least see them for what they are, because stories is powerful. Stories can heal, or stories can kill. There's good story and there's bad story, and there's a lot of bad story in the world right now, you know, and it has us chasing ghosts. It has us, you know, so for example, most indigenous resistance and minority resistance on the planet right now is all going towards the same impossible goal of trying to make this civilization fair and sustainable. And it's not. Civilization is not sustainable, and it's built on inequality. That's the only way it can work, because it attempts to break the laws of physics, which it can't. So over time, it needs to extract, you know, more than what there is. And in order to do that, people have to be killed. People have to be oppressed. The land has to be destroyed. That's what a civilization is. And the idea of all of us fighting for a place at the table so that we can have a say in that, and that we can benefit from the destruction of creation and the destruction of our communities, and that we can have a black face at the boardroom table, you know, that we can have an Asian voice or a gay voice or a female voice, you know, in you know, helping to destroy the entire world. And that's inclusivity, you know. The inclusivity always occurs, you know, during the decline of any civilization. So historically, you look back and you're going to see that's one of the indicators. So, you know, in Rome, they had senators from all the vassal sort of lands that they'd conquered all around. There were senators and even consuls from Gaul. You know, it's like, yeah. So there's a guy with a toga and a mustache. Inclusivity, you know. Oh yeah, we're being more fair in our destruction of half the world. You know, yeah, we're going to be fair and inclusive about that, so that people feel better about it. You know, so we're all engaged in this. You know, all of our resistance is pointing the wrong way, because we're living under these wrong stories. This wrong story that civilization is something that is just natural and inevitable, but it is falling, and it will fall, and we need to still have the capacity to allow the emergence of new stories. But we can't just make these up. You can't just invent the stories. We've got to stop this ancient oppressive, horrible system of inventing stories about the past, in order to control the present and then
So
control the future.
excuse me, would you say that part of the work then is to, in ourselves, to sort of foster a sense of receptivity to the stories of creation, as you say? That
Yeah, certainly. But first you have to abandon your wrong stories. So even the idea, and it feels like a good, Black Lives Matter is, everybody can agree on that. Everybody should agree on that. But what are we all fighting for? We're fighting for what? To try and make the civilization more fair, for people of all different skin colors. That it's a lie, because the fact is, the prison industrial complex is a real thing. And from my understanding, if that was suddenly removed from your economy, your entire economic system would collapse. The prison industrial complex is a way of continuing to prop up your nation with slavery by another name. That was and it was even written into the Constitution, that a person couldn't be a slave anymore, unless they're a criminal. So the prison industrial complex is, you have all these privatized prisons, and it's massive big business. And if that went away overnight, if suddenly Black lives were allowed to actually matter, then your economy would collapse and the entire global economy would collapse as well, which it's going to do anyway. So, there's things we can be looking at, bigger stories and bigger patterns, where we really need to allow the new stories to emerge and figure out, what it is as humans that we're supposed to be doing, because it's not this, and if we're all struggling to equally participate in the destruction of the earth, so that it's at least fair, that we're all equally killing ourselves together. That's wrong story. That's got to go, and we got to go from there.
Yeah.
But see, that's a big leap.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we're starting to get a number of questions
Yes.
from the crowd. So Susan, you want to?
I just was thinking of the one by Rachel Yearberry from Australia. She said you talked about patterns of land and patterns of knowledge, and she just wanted to hear you say more about that. So would you please?
Yeah, well, knowledge is it's not a thing we carry in our brains. Knowledge is something it's from that emergence as well. Knowledge emerges in creation, and knowledge is embodied in every element of creation, in every being, every entity, every phenomenon, every rock, every ant, every leaf, everything, contains knowledge. So to be engaging with knowledge is to make sure that you're a fully aware, embedded part of that creation. And when you're embedded in it and you're embodied within that knowledge, then you see the pattern. You see the patterns of knowledge, and they're in everything, if that makes any sense. So in the book, in order to do that, I make the writing of that book a very, what they call haptic activity. So that haptic cognition is a scientific term referring to neural processes that happen outside of the brain. And so there are several species that do this. There's some otters and a few different kinds of simians. And I think starfish also have that, what they're calling distributed cognition. The eukognition is not just contained within your brain or even within your body. So a lot of people are trying to break down that mind-body sort of barrier culturally, to understand the way your mind goes through your body, but it doesn't just do that. It goes out, into the world around you. And it's embodied not just in the things, but in the spaces in between things. It's in the relationships between things. I was talking to a Samoan fella yesterday. He was saying, I think their word for it is va. And he said that you learn it from when you're a little kid and your mum takes you down to the beach and teaches you what that word means, or you're standing at the water's edge and you're coming into an awareness of your feet in the sand. And then that water comes up, that wave comes up and washes over your feet and the sand. And there's a space in between those three things, between your feet and the sand and that water, and you're feeling that relation. And that's how you come into that understanding that there is knowledge in the spaces in between things that aren't really spaces, they're connections. There's knowledge carried in that. And I mean, this is, I really like the work of Nora Bateson. If anyone's come across the concept of warm data, which is kind of really taking off virally globally at the moment. And warm data is a way of quantifiably measuring the knowledge, the information that lies in the relationships between people and things. It's really exciting. So that knowledge is dynamic. It's not something that's visible, but people are finding ways of measuring it. There's also integrated into information theory. If you look that one up, that's really interesting. They've found a way to quantify the consciousness of all things. So they can mathematically measure the consciousness of a rock now through integrated. And I know that sounds like a snowflake thing, like a woo-woo thing, but it's really not. These are some of the, world's top scientists who are working on defining what consciousness is. And it's pretty exciting work. So they've got all these mathematical formulas and ways of actually measuring consciousness in things, what we're calling consciousness. But this comes back to the problems with English, is that that word and all those other words that are just abstracts, all these abstract nouns that aren't connected to anything. Consciousness is not a good way. It's not the same as that Samoan idea of va and being at the water's edge and that experiential haptic knowledge of what that relation is. And that's just the first of 5 stages of coming into knowing about that concept in the Samoan way. So yeah, it's it's a very big field, and I guess English language is a difficult thing to try and explore this in, but even more so, print is a difficult thing because you come across some problems, some ontological problems of freezing knowledge in a time and place. So I mean, my book is a moment in time from ages ago, and all the actual knowledge of that book, there's a lot more to it, but then it's also something that's really dynamic and it's changed. The knowledge of that book has changed with so many of these yarns that I'm not even involved with. Other people are having these yarns all over, and that knowledge is changed. It's living. It's a living, breathing thing, and it's taken its own life. There's 1,000 volumes of that book now, and it's the book itself is just almost a record of one point in time in the constant motion and growth of that knowledge.
There's someone who wants to, who's asking about language, the English language being limiting, as you say, and doesn't capture the complexity of our experience. If you had an ideal language, she wants to know, that would reflect the complexity of our histories and our lives, and I'll add the land. What would it look like?
Well, they're everywhere. There's a lot of them, and it's any language that is a regional language rather than a national language.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at I guess what they call in Europe provinces or whatever, but if you look at regions that, and you always look at the boundaries of these things and they don't seem to make any sense how those borders formed. But usually they're encompassing a bioregion, and the language of that bioregion has developed to completely reflect and describe creation in that place. And so the language is coming from that land. It's a place-based language. And you see these everywhere. There's heaps of them. There's 500 different ones in Australia. There's, I think if you ever go to, but even when you go to Europe, you can see people's accents are affected regionally by the landscape is still shaping them. So even in Britain, where English comes from, everyone's forced to speak English and they've forgotten their original languages and the languages of those places. There would have been, 20 different languages at least in Britain originally, but everyone's speaking English there now. But they're very different Englishes. You see the land is still shaping people's accents in those bioregions. But English itself is a trade Creole, and it's placeless. It's something that's developed out of this big project of creating the Anglosphere, which is a big placeless sort of skin of wrong story that's stretched around the planet. And you can see that coming out historically out of what happened with John Cecil Rhodes in Zimbabwe. He's one of I can't think of any other examples of people who've had entire countries named after them. Because Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia, was named after him. And he started that big extraction process there in Africa. And he was like the richest man on the planet when he died. And he willed his entire fortune into a foundation that was, its sole purpose was to create the Anglosphere, was to extend the dominance of the Anglo language and culture and people all over the world. And that succeeded. And the foundation is still there. Anybody who's ever had a Rhodes Scholarship has benefited from that. But anytime you hear the word Round Table Group, he was obsessed with Arthurian legend and Camelot and all this sort of thing. So he started these round table groups, which are basically, think tanks from the old days, and you still see them happening all around the world today, making all these horrific plans and extending the influence of this monstrous lie of a story that's gone over all around the planet, to the extent that if you want to do business, you have to learn English. It doesn't matter what country you're in. And, you might think you're maintaining your culture, but you're still using the calendar. I mean, everybody has to use the same calendar, don't they? You're allowed to keep yours, like, if you want to, that you can use informally. But if you want to do business, which you have to be a nation. And that nation has to have, a few standard things. It has to have a central bank and a flag and a national anthem and all these recognizable institutions that are the same as, throughout the rest of the Anglosphere. And if you're not one of those nations and you're not learning English and you're not participating in the calendar and the everything else and the economic system, if you're not doing that, then you will be destroyed. This is why Indigenous peoples all around the world have started to come into this idea of being First Nations. The concept of nation is only about a century old. We didn't used to have nations. We had, regional groups with regional languages that were coming out of the land. And this just juggernaut has just taken over.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Save mine.
I was just going to say, we're getting quite a few questions from the audience.
Yeah.
So,
I'd be interested to hear. Susan
we've asked two of them.
Trying to come in a few times.
Well, one thing I would you say that one of the things that's happened with cities and with English being the placeless language is what we don't have is that relationship that pays attention to and discovers the patterns and has a community of people who also have looked at those patterns, and that is the right story. They develop these stories that that are related to the place that they are at.
Mm.
And that's the regional thing you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
But the wrong story has taken over.
yeah. But there's also, it's important to note that these regions traditionally throughout human history have been quite syndicated with other regions. So that, there's a lot of exchange between the regions and, you know, ambassadorship kind of stuff going on there. But definitely trade and trade routes and all these things that extend the sphere of trust beyond your bioregion and out to many other bioregions. And that was the economic system before. See, an economic system is a way of, it's basically about trust. You know, I'll do this and then you'll do that, and I can trust you to do that. Yeah, and I guess as these massive nations developed, and of course a lot of horrible things had to be done, you know, trust broke down, so we needed these monetary systems to be able to guarantee that that trust, to be able to extend that sphere of trust globally, which has been quite disastrous because it's fairly untrustworthy anyway. Yeah.
So just a sort of timekeeping note, we have a half a dozen questions here from folks that we'd really like to get to, and
Yeah, keep them coming.
Yeah, that's that might be about as far as we get, just because of everybody's time. So
We've done
we'll
two
see.
of them.
Yeah. So Michelle McFadden asked a while back, why do the grand stories need to go? Are you talking about cultural stories, like that there need to be winners and losers, or that some people are more worthy than others? Or are you talking about grand stories like the great novels and myths and fairy tales?
No, not those. Just so mainly the big myths that hold civilization in place. So, for example, the biggest, most destructive grand narrative is the story of progress, the idea of progress. You know, and this is, you know, the thing that puts our time onto an arrow of time, and it's part of the problem of print language. You know, so print language was invented to try and control the present by forcing our time into a straight line. So, you know, you control the stories of the past, and you make sure that you show that the past was really crappy and that now is better. And then you guarantee that, well, every day things are going to get better and better. We are going to get better. We're going to develop and, you know, evolve. So there's this idea of progress, but that has to be grounded in a wrong story of primitivism too, so that, you know, your past was brutish and savage and horrible and violent, and where, you know, civilization is bringing you out of that and developing your brain and your mind so that you're so much smarter than your ancestors were. And that's a lie, because civilization devolves people. So it's those grand narratives. It's not, I mean, and they're contained, I guess, in the works of the canon. Yeah, but I'm not talking about, you know, getting rid of all the old legends or attacking the great works or anything like that. It's more about those big narratives, those grand narratives. Yeah, those big lies.
There's someone, Sally Stockwell wants to know, with so many people living largely disconnected from the natural world, how can they tap into Indigenous knowledge and use that knowledge in today's world?
Yeah, well, I guess it starts with not looking elsewhere. You know, so not looking to the margins and to the edges of society, although it is good to share stories, you know, across with as many different groups of people as you can. But it's mostly about finding that within yourself, about what it really is to be human, and about what it is, you know, to be coming back into our role as the custodial species of the planet. It's to start to, you know, recognize your relation, not just to other humans, all other humans, but also to non-human entities or the non-human beings, that we're all supposed to be in this dynamic relation with, and this custodial relation. It's simply coming into that.
I think on behalf of the Natural History Institute, I would say that the practice of natural history that we define as a practice of attentiveness and receptivity to the world around us is a step in that direction, because of how it fosters humility and attentiveness and awareness of diversity and so on. So.
Yeah, and I guess it's all tied in with those previous questions. Like once you free yourself from the big narratives, then this narrative of a primitive past, where no woman was safe, and that it's just like this idea that we're just these monkeys in clothes, this idea that we're these basically there's this thin civilized veneer over these primitive savages who, like, if left to our own devices, it would just be violence and rape and murder like it was in the past. That's not what the past was. We didn't evolve to become these beings. If you into natural history, you look at how things evolve perfectly to match their environment and their ecological niche. So how do we evolve to be pretty weak? I mean, physically, we're quite weak compared to most animals. We're, we have this massive brain. What kind of lifestyle would have to have been living for at least 500,000 years to develop this body and this mind that we have? And you start asking yourself those questions, then the old stories don't stand up anymore. They fall apart. But particularly, and I guess it came out of what I was just saying, this big lie story about what it is to be man and what it is to be woman. These grand narratives around gender that have divided half the planet against itself. Where we've got half of our human population dominating aggressively the other half of the population. So in the same way that that an imperial culture will dominate, destroy, and enslave, another culture or another group of people. This is what this Anglosphere, this global culture is demanding of us as men, is to terrorize anybody that's female, and most women are living in fear and having to build their lives around that, around protective behaviors that mean that they can't move like the being that they're supposed to be in the world. In Aboriginal culture, that mother, that woman, is at the center of all things. She's the one who makes life. She's and she's supposed to have all this power and autonomy and authority, and that's just not there in this culture right now. Women are forced to live in fear. I had a story about that I was thinking about this morning, but I don't think we have time. We don't have time for that. But these are the things we need to challenge. These are the things that we can't just tinker with the system that we've got and change it. We need to allow new stories to emerge by reconnecting with what we really are, which is not this.
Yes.
And that's part of what some people are asking. And it's really difficult, I think, having read your book, where everything belongs to everything else, to answer some of the questions. But one person has asked if there's any favorite story or allegory metaphor that you would care to share with us.
Well,
There's a
there
lot
is
in your book.
Yeah, well, there's that that story is from the Barkindji people. It was shared with me from Western New South Wales, It was a story of a time where all the different tribes from around that region and even out a bit further, that they all came together for a ceremony, and they sort of settled in one place, but then they stayed there, because there was so much abundance. They just ended up creating this sedentary, pretty much like a civilization, basically, where they were sitting in one place. They stopped moving with the land. They stopped speaking all their different languages, and they started speaking just one language. And so they lost their diversity, and they lost their mobility and their ability to adapt. Unfortunately, what happens is the land moves, and if you're no longer living a life, or you no longer have a culture that moves with the land, then the land will move you in pretty cataclysmic ways. So when there was a meteor strike near there, instead of the people being distributed around the land with lots of diversity that could recover from such a thing, this group of people was almost wiped out. And so they learned that lesson there. And that dreaming story talks about all the different, it talks about the heat burning marks into different goannas, which are like big monitor lizards, to remind people of maintaining that diversity. And to me, that's a story that's all around the world. It's in the Bible. It's that Tower of Babel is the same story. If you don't maintain your diversity, and you're not moving with the land and being, of the land and of the landscape, then, you are, you're not going to last. If you're not moving with the land will move you. And I think that's one of the big central stories I think that all human beings carry in every culture around the planet. You find that one repeated everywhere. Mm.
Eric Hallman asked a question I think you sort of addressed along the way, but put it out there again. He said, would you agree that each of us is an Indigenous person to our own place and time?
Yeah, but see, there's that problem with English again. It's that term Indigenous. And then, but all the, I don't know. I hesitate to so, yeah, look, I think a non-Indigenous person is just a domesticated human that's been removed from a memory of living sustainably on a land base. That's my definition, but a lot of people have a lot of different definitions. And, I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, bros, you're Indigenous, so that he then goes on Twitter and says Tyson Yunkaporta says I'm Indigenous too, and sort of use that to try and eclipse other people's identities and experience and lived reality. I don't know this fella. He might, we have an extreme right-wing politician in Australia, who just sort of completely.
Luckily, we don't have those here,
No.
Denies the legitimacy pretty much of all, Indigenous people in Australia by saying, well, we're all Indigenous. If we're born here, you're Indigenous. That's it, and it just kind of washes over this problematic extractive relation that we have with each other, that is a reality that we all have to deal with and live with in some way. You can ignore it, or you can actually be in the reality and try and react to that. And I think a lot of people try and just wash it over because they don't like discomfort. But I guess you got to be comfortable with a bit of cognitive dissonance. We're in times where the only cognition that any of us are able to have is dissonant. So if you're comfortable with any idea you have, then you're an idiot. You're living a lie. So just, be uncomfortable. Struggle with these things a bit. And let's say you're doing some inner work and, you get in touch with your real humanity and you start to live in connected, related ways. You're going to ruin that if you run out into the world and start posting about it. Oh, I'm Indigenous. Yeah, all right, man. Whatever. Hey.
Yeah, I would encourage the book as a whole explains a lot of these things and they're very difficult to explain disconnected from other things, but
Yeah,
also the idea that when we're so disconnected from the land and cities, you say in the book that cities are not sustainable, but here we have the world with practically nothing but big cities, and people want to live there, and I don't see anyone wanting to get rid of those cities, and it makes for a very hard way to live sustainably
yeah.
when most people by their where they live
Yeah,
could not and have
there's
lost stories.
there's almost nothing that's happening under that brand of sustainability that is sustainable. You know, I keep seeing that term being bandied around, and I look, you know, people might be running we're doing a sustainable energy project, you know, putting in solar panels. I'm like, how the hell is solar panels sustainable? You know, there's rare earth metals in there, and refining rare earth metals, which are rare, by the way, they won't last indefinitely. And they have to be replaced every couple of decades or something. Oh my God, refining the rare earth metals produces radioactive waste. You might as well be just put in a nuclear power plant. You know, it's solar panels aren't sustainable. You know, none of this stuff is sustainable. So just don't use the word unless you mean it. You know, pastoralism is a sustainable way of life. You know, foraging is a sustainable way of life. There are forms of agriculture that are sustainable, you know, and
I mean, the
so
words.
these are sustainable things, but you know, the systems that we have in place now are not sustainable. And people, you know, there's what people think they want, and then there's what they're really longing for. You know, and I think if you've been given limited poison stories and you're like, oh, people want to live in cities, well, they don't know what else there is. They have no other stories because other stories haven't been allowed to emerge. So you know, it's the best work you can do is to create spaces that are grounded in reality from which new stories can emerge, and allow these stories to just get out there and glitch this matrix slightly and just see what can fall out of there. You know, because if we don't allow that emergence to happen, I mean, pretty damn quick, we got some problem.
So we have 3 questions from the audience. So I think a couple of them have been waiting for a while. So I think we'll try to get to those 3, and then I think by the time we're done there, we'll have been going for about an hour and a half. And probably be good to
Yep.
tie things up. So Barbara Jacobson says, keeping and carrying the memory I love, even though my ancestors traveled up from Africa to Europe and Scandinavia, where is my land? And my few close relatives and children seem disinterested. So how does one preserve the memory, the knowledge? I know some is just in there. Perhaps I need to speak more of what I may intuitively know to my grandchildren.
See, that's the thing about diaspora, and pretty much most humans on the planet are diasporic right now. You know, so you're bringing patterns from another place into dialogue with the patterns of a new place, and things emerge from that dialogue. You know, a lot of people, you know, feel lost about that, the conflict of their you know, their biological identity with things coming together. You know, it's that's why any complex dynamic system, you know, survives by through diversity, through very diverse nodes throughout that system coming together, which, you know, and the more different those things are that come together, the more dynamic the relation is, the more creative it is, and the more emergence you get. Yeah, so I guess I would say to her that that if she's carrying that pattern from that other place, and she's bringing that into dialogue with the pattern of where she is, then things will emerge from that. And one of the things that will emerge from that is her children and their way of being in the world. That is a product of that combinatorial, and that's a beautiful thing. I've got kids who aren't interested too. I know. Like I understand that frustration. Yeah, I got a couple of grown kids that aren't interested in my way at all. Yeah.
So John Armstrong asks you if you have seen the Clever Man series, and what is your view of that story in terms of lateral violence and hubris, plus the unwise revelation of sacred energy. Should that be gotten rid of or shared more?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's a lot in that. I wrote a review of that series, of the second season when that came out, I recall. Yeah, that was a really funny. That was a good show, that one. But yeah, I think that was one of the more important things coming out of that show, was that understanding of the extractive relation, that occurs between the dominant culture and the indigenous culture, and where sharing is often, it's done in good faith, but it results in pretty horrible things happening. And you'll find that with every indigenous group on the planet. When invaders first arrive, we're very bloody generous. And generous even after there's been massacres and attempted genocides and just horrific things happen. A lot of people continue to be so generous. And I don't know, I never believed that Bible story of turn the other cheek. Turn the other cheek if you want. You're definitely going to get that other cheek slapped, but not only that, you're probably going to get kicked in the nuts and hospitalized as well, if not killed. But at the same time, to go the other way and come out swinging, that results often in exactly the same result. So, I don't know. That, like I keep saying, there are big stories driving these things, wrong stories, and it's understanding. If you can see them for the illusion they are, then you get past all that other stuff. Hubris, lateral violence, that's oppressed people taking on aspects of the dominant culture, taking on aspects of the grand narratives and lies, and we're all guilty of that. Yeah, it's just where you draw that line in the sand to try and keep yourself human, some part of you human.
Yeah. The last question, can I ask it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great closer.
Luana Durbin wants to know, she said, do you see anything positive that you can see, something going on positive? Please, she says.
Yeah, heaps of things, all these movements that are happening around the world and that have been happening, for a decade or more now. You see these movements come out, and then people see the demise of the brand of that movement, and they assume that movement finished and was a failure in some way. But what I've seen in the pattern of things, when I look at all these movements, I see that they don't die with the branding, that they're actually liberated by the death of the brand. So do you remember the brand Occupy?
Yeah.
Yeah, the brand died. It failed spectacularly. But the movement itself, I don't know if anybody's been tracking the way that went into spore mode and the amazing things that have come out from that. So the alumni of the Occupy movement have been producing amazing innovations all around the planet. From well, just the Inspiral software stuff out of New Zealand that came out of the Occupy movement. So basically, what came out of the Occupy movement was a distributed model of governance that could work across all cultures and all different kinds of people. Really exciting. A really strong decentralizing imperative came out of that. And that pattern has spread like crazy, throughout the world. And it's emerged alongside, a lot of tech communities, a lot of that are interested in, the blockchain and digital currencies and all these kinds of things. They're all driven by that same, deep need and understanding. This idea of decentralizing power, decentralizing these institutions and economies, and growing something organic and collective out of that. And there are amazing things happening all around the world. So when your brand dies, you're free. Any movement, any idea, kill the brand, free the idea. The pattern will spread. So anyway,
words to live by.
Yeah, that's why I kill my brand every day.
Well, thank you so much. That's a wonderful place to stop, I think. So I'd say, again, the book is Sand Talk, and you got a very positive thing happening in the world in and of itself, and the reception that it's getting. So congratulations again, Tyson, on the book, and thank you for joining us here from tomorrow. It's another day over there. And and I also want to thank all of the people who have been joining us from all over the world, actually. So we really appreciate it. And on behalf of both the Natural History Institute and the Peregrine Book Company, thank you, Tyson, and thanks to everybody. Also wanted to mention that we've gotten a lot of questions, and some people wanted to be here and couldn't. So just so you know, there will be a video of this will be available. It'll be archived on our end. It'll be archived on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel. And I know Peregrine is going to be posting it somewhere as well, or having it accessible in one way or another. And so you can, if people were not able to be here for this event, you can help them share that as well. Susan?
Yes, I just want to say same thing, but I want to repeat again that the book has everything, questions that people are asking. Some of them are just really in the book, and if you haven't read it, please do read it. And thank you so much, I want to say, Tyson, for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Good yarns.
Yes, I think so.
So with that, we will say good night or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peregrine. Thank you, Tyson. And we will say goodbye for now.